following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners around the world on radio, streaming, and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Liana, and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for navigating the madness of mental health using my top 10 sayings for going good crazy. This week, I'm going to talk about joyful effort. Joyful effort is a concept from Buddhism, and our guest this week is author of the novel, How Joyous Effort Works. This author is also a coach, teacher, and student of Buddhist Dharma. Janet Ettele will be joining us later. I'm not going to get too deep into the Buddhist stuff because, you get into Buddhism, things go really deep. I'm not an expert, and, well, we only have so much time. But the Sanskrit term for joyful effort is also translated as energy, persistence, perseverance, vigor, effort, diligence, and enthusiasm. It's sort of a collection of concepts, and I can already hear some of you rolling your eyes because toughness is miserable, right? Nope, wrong. In a lot of ways, this Buddhist concept has masculine connotations, and it's the opposite of glowering like a particularly corny version of Batman. The more you invest in a concept, the more aware of it you become. The more aware of it you become, the more it's going to multiply in your life. So if you're defined by hating everywhere you are and everything you do, guess what you're going to get? Guess what you're going to see? More stuff you hate, right? Too many people link achievements to happiness. Oh, I meet this goal, then I'll be happy. I'll get $1 billion, I'll be happy, right? But the truth is that happiness, a real core sense of being okay, is what gives you the perseverance to achieve the things you want to achieve. Because there's no amount of followers, fame, clout, or money that's going to make an unhappy person into a happy one. While poverty does contribute to unhappiness, sure, right? If you got to struggle more, you're struggling more. There are a lot of people, though, who are well off and still the most unpleasant people you will meet in your entire life. Western culture actively teaches this unhappiness, at least in my opinion. We're taught to think in these chains of increasing catastrophe, right? Instead of connecting good things together. The most common thing I hear from students these days, or people just entering the workforce, is, they're going to fail a test or an interview, so, they won't pass, or they won't graduate, or they won't get the job, and they'll end up homeless and dying poor. It escalates rapidly. Instead of focusing on learning the material, preparing, they're putting unhappy effort into the hypothetical consequences of not doing the thing they just have to knuckle down and do. The task doesn't change if you approach it with a more productive focus on what you have to do instead of what will happen if you fail. You're just using your energy on that task instead of negative what-ifing. But even the advice to avoid negativity is done through negativity, right? I've talked about this before, but when I was younger, it used to drive me crazy how older relatives would go, Liana, don't be negative, without giving any concrete advice or an example of how to be more positive. The answer was just be positive. If you don't see a ton of examples, what does that mean? Okay, I admit it. People who talk that way still drive me crazy. Why? Because it suggests that the person really doesn't know how to take a positive outlook. They tell kids to figure something out that these adults don't exactly have a grasp on themselves. It's a dodge, right? Because a positive outlook isn't ignoring negatives, not acknowledging negatives. That's why I say top 10 phrase, ignoring negatives isn't being positive. A positive outlook takes active work. Let me give you an example. Failure. Hey, cheery topic, right? But failure is a part of life. avoiding failure, if you try to get 100% no failure, that means avoiding trying anything. If you make attempts at things, you will sometimes fail. But an intense focus on avoiding failure means that your chances of success go way down because you're making fewer attempts. Make sense? But there's this huge focus on avoiding failure. And I get it. We culturally humiliate people that try and fail. We've glorified revenge and made learning from our mistakes into a form of weakness. It drives me nuts. People actively compete these days to prove they're more oppressed than their neighbors when everyone involved in this competition has a college degree, is employed, lives in relative safety on a diet provided by DoorDash. Like, seriously, someone delivered you food because you didn't want to walk 15 minutes or cook, and you probably didn't tip them properly, and you still think you're oppressed. That's self-oppression right there, but also tip your food delivery person. But that's what adulthood has become, right? Spreading the misery around because of responsibilities we don't embrace, and therefore we resent them and confuse these responsibilities that aren't bad. We confuse that with oppression. We focus on how hard parenting is, how hard holding a job is, how hard getting a job is, how hard paying bills are. And okay, all of this is hard. But it isn't only hard, right? We resent our jobs even if we have this dire fear of losing them. We even manage to make holidays, every holiday a different way. We manage to make it into an exercise in draining obligation instead of joyful effort. Christmas trees are a symbol of colonization. Gift wrapping is presented as something that keeps women down. And okay, these may be your sincerely held beliefs, but what are they doing for you? Passover started this past weekend, and okay, it's a lot of work. And I'm very familiar with the time-honored tradition of a lot of complaining about that work. I've heard my share of bitter jokes that women were never freed from slavery because, well, the bulk of the cooking, cleaning, and organizing is traditionally women's work, so women still end up doing the lion's share of it. And no joke, it is a lot of cleaning, and it has to be done in a compact amount of time. But when it comes right down to it, we choose to do this. We're not forced. So it's either an opportunity to complain and be miserable or an opportunity to reflect on the people in the world who have it a lot worse right now. And there are a lot of those people. And now I also have a clean microwave, air fryer, and coffee maker. I didn't get the oven cleaned, so I won't use it for a week, or maybe I'll clean it because then it will be clean. See, I had a choice. I could hate every minute of this custom I choose to participate in, or I could recognize that doing the work meant having clean stuff. And that coffee maker turned out to be surprisingly nasty. The beauty of freedom of religion and freedom of choice is that if something is miserable to the point of being bad crazy, we're not forced to do it to satisfy some government-enforced religious doctrine. Our choices can be truly ours. Now, are these choices consequence-free? Well, no. But missing the joy that can be found in effort means we're denying ourselves a lot of that day-to-day happiness. But that's my perspective from my faith, and I want to bring you another one after the break, because sometimes some traditions say things in a way that others don't, and it's like, click, yeah, it makes sense. How Joyous Effort Works author Janet Ettele, who's also a coach, teacher, and student of Buddhist Dharma, will join us after the break. Do you have a story you think would be good for the show? Are you interested in sponsoring the show? Liana at nottherapyshow.com. Nottherapyshow.com is the website, at nottherapyshow on social media. We'll be back after this with author Janet Ettele, Joyous Effort on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back and It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. It is time for the interview. Like I said, we have a fiction author on this week. She's not just an author. She's a coach, a teacher, a musician, and most importantly, and a parent and a grandparent, but she's also a student of Buddhist Dharma. And that's what I'm going to focus on mostly here. The author of How Joyous Effort Works, Janet Ettele. Janet, welcome to It's Not Therapy. How are you?
Thank you so much. I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Good. Now, How Joyous Effort Works is the fourth book in the series, right?
Yes,
And what's
yes.
sort of the overview of this series of novels?
It is a story it's a series of books that is really based on a particular teaching that was taught by an 8th century Buddhist monk and scholar back in India named Master Shantideva. And this teaching is known as the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. And the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life presents something called the six perfections of generosity, moral and ethical discipline, patience, joyous effort, concentration, and wisdom. Those are the six. And so what I've done, along with the publisher that I've worked with, this was his idea actually, and I happened to be the person writing it, is to take these teachings and put them into contemporary fiction with Western characters living our contemporary life. And in my opinion, I feel that when we have these characters that we can relate to and perhaps feel some kind of connection with, excuse me, that we can sort of experience that character's learning, his reflection on what's being presented in the teachings, his meditations, and also his taking what he's learned into his everyday life, encountering a myriad of things as we all do in daily
Mm-hmm.
life. And we kind of get to be the fly on the wall as he then applies these teachings into his daily life.
Mm-hmm. And I like how you frame that because a lot of people do see Buddhism in this very exoticized form, right? There's sort of an aesthetic as opposed to the way, literally. And I do find a lot of the teachings get lost in the gimmicks, right? And How Joyous Effort Works is about, a young man in his 20s. It's almost like a Catcher in the Rye setup. Background with substance abuse, the idea of anger, which I want to get on, and he sort of gets onto, sort of the middle path under the guidance of a Buddhist sage.
Yes.
Now, because a lot of people see this kind of stuff with the meditation and all that as not relevant to a modern life. How do you respond to that?
Ah, that's that's a really big question
Yeah.
in a way. I mean, I could make that huge.
Take it anywhere
But
you want. I didn't want to bias the answer.
yeah, but feel free to kind of interrupt if I'm going off someplace that doesn't
Hmm.
feel relevant to what you were really trying to get to.
Hmm.
But one thing to understand about meditation is that meditation literally is a method to familiarize your mind to something. Okay, it could be, meditation is maybe you're studying for an exam and you're really rehearsing that. That's a form of meditation. They have analytical meditation where you're maybe presented with a topic such as impermanence, which is a big one in Buddhism,
Hmm. Hmm.
or the faults of anger, or because you mentioned anger. There's so many things that you then can meditate on those in an analytical way.
Right.
And then we have the calm abiding, where kind of meditation, which is perhaps like focusing on your breath and just trying to bring your attention to only your breath. But we can even take those things that we've been analyzing in analytical meditation once we've really done that, we can then settle into a more focused meditation on that. And that becomes our rehearsal, sort of, for what we deal with in life. But something I want to say about this, what are we familiarizing our minds to?
Mm-hmm.
If we think about the number of thoughts we think in every day, even if it's a thought per second, something like 57,600, if we sleep 8 hours a night, we have that many waking
Mm-hmm.
seconds to where we have thoughts. And there have been some studies that say somewhere around 80 to 90% of the thoughts we think are repeated daily. So those are our own very unconscious meditations that we're rehearsing and deepening. And I think of it like, if you were to roll a wheel back and forth over the dirt, it just gets deeper and deeper and deeper, where you don't even need to steer that wheel any longer. It just
There's
goes
a
on that.
groove. Yeah.
So meditation is a really helpful way of what we call training the mind,
Mm-hmm.
cultivating awareness of what is happening in the mind, and learning how to understand what that is, and with that understanding where it needs to be tweaked, we can then do that.
Yeah. And that's where the joyous effort comes in, right? Because it is a really interesting concept that I wish more people focused on. We hear about, all the stuff that ended up in Star Wars, attachments and avoiding hate and all that stuff. But the idea of effort as something that can bring joy. I think that is one of those unconscious meditations. It's hard. Everything's hard. I'm so tired, and if you focus on that, that's the first thing that comes to mind whenever you start a task. But when you go, this is going to be good for me and I'm going to learn something and it's going to be interesting, it's much easier to take the first step into change, right? And the thing about that groove that you were talking about is the deeper that groove gets, the harder getting out of it is.
Which is what I hope I'm presenting in my books, is the Buddhist view is so rich. It's really a philosophical view. And when we can start to like open our mind to another way of seeing things, that is not like woo-woo out in the clouds
Hmm.
someplace, but
Hmm.
it's observable realities that we can relate to, it's logical and grounded. We then can kind of give ourselves some support to help us shift out of that groove. And the joyous effort, I think too, is when as you were saying, when we understand the value of something, when we understand the benefit of something, then we're excited to do whatever it is, even if it is hard work.
Hmm.
But I think when we have resistance to things, it's worth checking into what am I resisting, when like you just can't push yourself into doing something, and coming to an understanding of what that is. And not in all cases, but sometimes I wonder what you would think about this, is when we're doing things that are out of alignment with what are like our deep values, then we're not going to be joyfully, there's going to be a lot of inner conflict and angst and resentment and all those other things that snarl up and can stand in our way too.
Well, then it becomes outcomes driven and you can't control those. And that's the suffering part, right? That if you set your goals based on, I say healthy goals are based on things you can control all the time on this show. It's because if you set like, I'm going to act in accordance with my values, I am going to feed myself positive statements, not diluted statements, just positive things based on fact. I can say this is what I can do instead of focusing on what I can't. That is very different, because no matter what you do, if you're living in if you're living in alignment with your values, then no matter what the outcome, you can go, well, I was true to myself, right? And that's an outcome in itself. And in dealing with addiction in the book, addicts, that's the core of it, right? Is there's something so painful that they're numbing, they can't feel their feelings, they can't process their emotions, everything's out of alignment. And it's not about the substance. The substance is the symptom a lot of the time of what's really going on underneath. Is that why you chose to focus on substance abuse and anger for Troy, the main character in your book?
Um, the I think the substance abuse was just part of, it's more in his past than it is in the present, of when the
Right.
story pick up.
Yeah, because the
Something,
story picks up in like in medias res, so to speak. Yeah. Already in
yeah.
progress. Yeah.
But the sort of in his reflection, we understand that he's not having a good time. Once you're addicted, you're not partying and having a great time. You're suffering.
Hmm.
And that addiction, that craving, all of that is just not, you're not happy
Yeah.
in that state
Yeah.
from what I have observed or understand and seen firsthand. So I feel that we all have various different addictions. Some of them are more destructive than others. And
And people can get addicted to concepts. They can get addicted to an identity, a piece of their identity, right?
yeah.
And those can really be I'm a bad person. I'm worthless. I am not going to amount to anything. These are things that aren't helpful and we don't have to think them, and yet a lot of people do.
That's so true. And you're right. And that's tragic.
Yeah. Yeah, and you hear it a lot. It's sort of the underpinning of modern discourse. You hear the words worthless, rotten, no good, disaster, and just hearing them, you feel like you've taken a bit of a hit, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things, as I mentioned a little bit ago, impermanence is one of the um, things that we learn to focus on early on when we first start to study any of this Buddhist and probably other traditions too. This just happens to be the one that I know.
Hmm.
But because of impermanence, we have the capacity to change all that. And that's, I think, a really helpful, like when you're down in that down place, that pit, it's a kind of like one of those rescue ladders that says, wait a second, nothing is permanent. This is not my destiny. And with some wisdom and some compassion, compassion for yourself and your own suffering, and just it all gives you a little space, even if it's small steps, but a little space to experience that potential for change, become actualized. And that's what this main character, Troy, we get to see him go through these changes where he goes from just being in a lot of pain and grief to coming to some peace.
You anticipated my next question, and I want to go to break because there is like the death and grieving and literal and when you mentioned impermanence, I thought that was sort of a good place because that's where a lot of people first, I think, encounter the idea that everything is temporary, nothing is permanent. We lose people, right? So we're gonna be after the break coming back talking about grief and joyous effort with author Janet Ettele, author of How Joyous Effort Works. She's also a student of Buddhist Dharma. As you can tell by the interview, we'll be back more with Janet after this on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in It's the Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. We're talking about Buddhist stuff. And I'm not an expert, of course, but I have author Janet Ettele, who is a student of Buddhist Dharma. And before the break, we were talking about her book, How Joyous Effort Works, and how joyous effort applies to facing change. And before the break, Janet, we were talking about impermanence and a key theme of your novel, the loss of the main character's uncle and him dealing with that. And the idea of impermanence, this is how I first sort of became aware of it. The first time you lose somebody like that, it's the hardest, especially when you're young, and it's terrifying for somebody to be there and no longer be there anymore. And we can tell ourselves all the stories we want. That death of a loved one is one of those impermanent things where we really have no choice but to let go or be miserable. So, how does your practice approach that very real, exclamation point on life?
Okay. Again, they're like, I've got like
Yeah.
three answers flying through my head right now. I'd say first in the first book and in the second book. So I've written these books in such a way that they can be read in any order because I weave the backstory of each book into the subsequent ones. But we learned that Troy, while he was away at college and while he was, dealing with all kinds of things, his very closest friend from home was killed.
Hmm.
That was the grief. That was his close friend, and that was one of his rocks in his young life. And that is what triggered him off into just, not going to classes, just drinking horrifically, getting into a lot of fights. And by the time in this fourth book, when he's lost his uncle, he's actually met and been helped very much by three different teachers that he meets in each of the previous books. And one of the reasons we focus or think about impermanence is also to understand the impermanence of our own lives. And by doing that, not in a morbid way to say, oh my God, I'm going to die. What's the point? Not like that. It's more like, of course I've been born, so of course I'm going to die. We don't know when our shelf life is going to
Hmm.
be there. And so we use that as an inspiration to make the best use we can of this life. So there's the
Hmm.
joyful effort too, of recognizing the value we have of being alive and the potential to do good things for others, to do, live a good life. And I think that in this fourth book on how joyous effort works, with his uncle's passing, he was an elderly man. So while it's a grief and it's a sadness, it's not an unexpected
Right.
loss,
Hmm.
where the death of his close friend was a
Right.
tragic young loss. And you're right, you just it takes time. And I don't want to pretend to say that, well, if you understand impermanence, you won't feel grief. I mean, that's just not
No,
feasible.
I would argue the opposite, that understanding impermanence means I'm not going to feel this way forever. So it's okay to take a moment and feel this way now. I'm not going to get stuck in it. I'm not going to lost in it. I'm not going to drown. I feel this way now. There will be a time I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of people are afraid to stop and feel negative emotions. And I mean, this is something that people find the concept of dharma, which is really poorly understood. People confuse it with karma, right? But how does that apply? Like when you say you're a student of Buddhist dharma, how did that study bring you here dealing with, like, you're kind of straddling two worlds, right? This very esoteric, very abstract, the theory of everything, the Paramatman, and then a very contemporary story in the West.
That is such a good question, really, because that's sort of where in this book, Troy, the main character, his thing is like, how can I do this? I want to have a regular, ordinary life. I want to. He has this girlfriend that he's crazy about and hopes that he can build a life with her. He needs to have a career, he realizes, and what is he going to do? And can you balance all of that with this deep spiritual practice?
Right.
Um, and how can I do that? And and that is something that the sage character that he meets in this book helps him to sort of to figure out.
Hmm.
Um, and it's like anything. I have two sons who go into, they have their work, they have their family, and they go through these different phases. One year it was golf. They were golfing all the time, and that takes up a huge amount of time
And money. Yep.
and money. And now, lately it's weightlifting, so
Mm-hmm.
you
Okay.
know, whatever it is, they do full throttle. And I think that people find a way to build these things into their lives. And what I have found in my own experience is the things that I have learned don't just stay in a little compartment on a bookshelf. Because I've learned them and because I've been reflecting and trying to implement what I've learned in my life, I have the experience of having experienced more peace. When things happen, I'm not rocked quite like I had been prior and years ago.
Right.
And, and it is something that it's not easy. Like if I have a practice and if I were to go away traveling, that's part of the question is like, oh, how am I going to, people are going to think I'm a nut if I'm like, excuse me, I have to go do a meditation practice or something.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something you find a way to build into your day.
Yeah, and these older belief systems, I mean, it's your life goes through twists and turns, and if you stay true to your core values, your beliefs, it'll be okay no matter what happens. That's what I think. Tell me if you agree or don't. These thousands and thousands of year old concepts do, right? You don't have to worry about outcomes as long as you're sticking to what you know is, I don't know if right is even the word righteousness is loaded.
Yeah. Um, I think it's interesting you mentioned how many thousands of years old these teachings are,
Hmm.
and yet human nature has been pretty consistent and
Yeah.
teach still apply. And in this how joyous effort works, there's a point in the story where Jules, who's the sage character, is talking to Troy about these teachings being like like the old days celestial navigation.
Hmm.
They're reliable guidance.
Everything else breaks, that still works. Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't need to plug in to navigate via the stars.
Yeah, you don't
Yeah.
have to worry about a satellite going down or anything like that. Those stars are there and you can use them no matter where you are and in what circumstance. You can draw from them.
But it doesn't give you everything either, does it? I mean, you do have to learn to trust whatever you want to call it, the divine spark, the inner voice, anything to get through this tough stuff, right? There has to be a certain belief that one, it matters because you can't motivate if it doesn't, but two, also there's a point or a purpose to all of it. And I think that contemporary life with all our distractions and all of this morality and weight we put on the tiniest little purchase at a convenience store, like, oh, that has moral weight, right? It takes us away from from the joyous effort, right? It's just effort, it's misery. It's not, there's nothing joyous about worrying about, the social circumstance about who picked your coffee beans. At some point you do have to go like, look, I'm just doing my best, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You
So
do.
how do you mix this, these traditional teachings that obviously come from both a more complex and simpler time because we didn't know as much scientifically, but some argue we had less to worry about as well. How do you mix that idea that living a good and purposeful life in accordance with deep values, and the word deep is pointed there, with the complexities of everything now?
Well, I want to, again, every question you've asked me, I have like five answers flying around in my head at the same time as you're asking. But so first of all, in these teachings, the Dharma, it's never something that you're supposed to take on and say, oh, because it says this, I must do it.
Hmm.
It's because it says this, let me think about it and see if this applies. See if this is grounded. Does this make sense? Is this true? Test it out. So that's one thing. And you talked about not having the scientific knowledge. Even so, 2,500 years ago, these Buddhist sages, or whatever you
Hmm.
want to call them, they understood that everything was like, they understood that everything was made up of these small little particles,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that nothing is inherently existent.
Yeah.
And based on nothing being inherently existent and everything being impermanent, we then know there's nothing to be attached to that's anything that's substantially there to be attached to. And as we remind ourselves of that, then it can soften some of that grasping we tend to do onto, like you said earlier, whether it's a right, being right about something, or that this is the destination I must achieve, or this person must never die, or this
Right.
relationship can't ever change. So we learn to realize the absurdity of expecting something that is impossible to
Right.
manifest.
Right. Right. And that's I think a really common misconception about Buddhism and the thing about avoiding attachment. It's not that you don't care about people. You care about
No.
people very, very, very deeply, but you can't hold on to something that doesn't want to be held on to.
My distinction is there's a difference between attachment and devotion. If you're devoted, your love is it's an outpouring of love. Attachment is like, I need you. I need you to always be there. I need you to always love me. I need you to whatever it is. It's
Right.
more about you than it is about the other person or
Yeah.
future or whatever.
We'd call it in a lot of circles a codependence.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny because attachment has entered popular culture through Star Wars, through anime, and all that stuff. And yet, because it's so personal, it's really hard to explain it. You know, when you've got a healthy devotion to something, as opposed to an unhealthy attachment to it. And sort of once you hit that wisdom, it's easy to keep, but getting there takes a lot of effort.
It takes a lot of openness.
Okay. Now, what's the distinction between effort and openness?
Well, openness is pretty easy. You just kind of allow yourself to think about something,
That's the
right?
hardest thing in the world for some people, though, because every thought that pops in their head, they judge. Like I've had this thought, oh, I shouldn't think that. That's bad. Why did I think that? Does that mean it's something about me? Like they get tangled up in it instead of just having the thought, acknowledging the thought, let the thought pass.
Okay, so there's that openness to, I guess at some point one has to be open to when your suffering is like, when you're miserable enough, you're going to say, I'd like to change this. I'd like
Right.
this experience to be
Mhm.
different. And then I think that in itself is a little opening to like, I need some help here.
Right.
Um, and it's as simple as like, realizing that that reflection you see in the mirror isn't the person, you
Right.
know. And so I'm using that as an example of like so many of the things that we get fixated on are things that we have concretized in our own minds as being something that lack that substantial quality.
Right. Now, you do coaching as well as a whole bunch of other things. Um, as a coach, if somebody came to you deep in self-judgment, deep in other judgment, deep in suffering, in misery, what would be the first thing you did with them to take that step into just misery into joyous effort?
That's a big question, and sort of in a broad sense, I don't know that it's a one size fits all for everyone
Let
that
me
comes.
let me give you an example because that whole thing about image. right? There's an increasing group of young men who think, oh, if I don't look like, Thor from the movies, women aren't going to like me. And I have to have, muscles and a lot of money and all that stuff. Now, we know that's not true, but they believe it. They are attached to that fallacy.
Mm.
How do you open a person like that up to another story?
Well, I don't know, but the first question that comes to my mind when I hear you present that is to ask, well, how does that serve you?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and the coaching process is of questioning,
Yeah,
because in coaching, you really, the person is the expert in their own life. And my job as the coach is to ask questions to help them sort of get to their own answers. And I can share, bits and pieces of things like I'm sharing with you, depending on everyone's openness. Not everybody wants to hear about
right,
Buddhism.
right.
Um, but to the degree that someone is open and receptive, I can present some of these ideas that aren't about religion.
Right.
They really aren't, in
Well,
in
there's no
Buddhism,
deity in Buddhism. There's no God.
there's no creator God.
Right. Yeah.
There is no creator God in Buddhism. They
Yeah.
do have, especially when you get into the Tibetan Buddhism, there's like deities like
All
galore.
over the place. Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, it's very clear you're a deep thinker, and we've just gotten into this discussion. And that's why your books exist, right? That's why you're here. If you guys like what Janet had to say, check out How Joyous Effort Works is her fourth book. So, Janet, can people just go to your website, janetettele.com, and find out? Yeah, it's how generosity works, how patience works. So it's each of the four perfection or the six perfections. They could start at the first one and just sort of work through.
They could actually, if I did my job well, if I succeeded in writing them so that the backstory is woven into all the other books, they could pick up with any book they wanted. But if they wanted to start from the beginning, yes, How Generosity Works is first. They're short reads, they're small books.
Hmm.
I would say they're quick reads, but from what feedback I get from people is people like to reread them. They like to underline things in
Oh
the
yeah,
book.
I was going back the quotes and like taking a moment and sitting with it. It's like, wow, that's profound. I really did feel the need to slow down and really read it instead of skim it. JanetEttele.com. Ettele is spelled Ettele. So Ettele to those of us Canadians, the Quebecois. Janet, thanks so much for coming on It's Not Therapy and sharing sort of your journey and your personal perspective.
Well, thank you so much. I'm loving your program, or your podcast, I should say. You can tell how old I am. I call it a program.
Well, it is
But
on the radio too, so I catch myself saying broadcast, like nope, 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 it's streaming now.
yeah, whatever the medium is, I'm really grateful for what you're doing. I think it's great work, and you do a fabulous job. So it's lovely to meet you, and thanks for the great conversation and wonderful questions, really.
You. All right, when we come back, final thoughts on how you can weave joyous effort into your life. It's not, as Janet said, it's not woo woo, it's every little day things. What is this doing for you? Back after this on It's Not Therapy. Questions, comments, concerns, Liana at nottherapyshow.com. Nottherapyshow.com is the website. At Not Therapy Show is our socials. Back after the break with more joyous effort on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. We're still talking joyous effort. And Janet Ettele was on the show before, last two segments, to talk about her perspective as a student of Buddhist Dharma and an author, and she's written a bunch of novels. And we talked about thoughts connected to effort. And I want to circle back around on that because there's a lot of reasons to not do things, to not try, to, hide away. People live in fear of cancellation, right? People complain about men being dangerous and women being manipulative, controlling, and cruel. So dating is terrifying and miserable, and the deck is stacked against us. And these are all excellent excuses to not start. And you don't need excuses. Just don't socialize. Just don't date. Our cultural attitudes towards human connection, romantic or otherwise, aren't great right now. Okay. But you don't have to explain why you don't want to socialize. You also don't have to explain wanting to be treated well. And you don't have to make up new words for lonely men or even men who mistreat women. I'm so sick of this word incel getting thrown everywhere. Netflix shows, it's all over it. Even the latest episode of Doctor Who dropped the word incel. And the idea that it's involuntary, real talk, okay? They would rather talk about women like especially ugly cattle than do the required things to get a woman to like them enough to want to be with them, to consent to sex. These are a series of voluntary choices. There's nothing involuntary about it. But, throwing the word incel around to just anybody you don't like, that too is a choice. All right? It's a cruel term with shifting meaning, designed to belittle. It doesn't even mean literally what people mean. And part of joyful effort is thinking deliberately and precisely, and then speaking deliberately and precisely. And if we deny ourselves these cheap insults, these various derogatory terms towards men, towards women, racial slurs, right? We can more precisely confront and communicate our issues with a given person, with a given place, with a given activity, right? Because part of the problem, part of the reason you're unhappy if you're doing stuff like this is you're picking these petty fights. And these things really don't matter, okay? Try this instead. Say openly that you like something. Oh, so, I really like it. And notice how the people around you respond. Do they join your happiness? Do they ask questions about why you like it, even if they don't? Or do they leap to criticize? Because criticism is a low-effort activity. It's so easy to criticize. So people who praise instead, that is joyful effort. And I am out of time. Questions, comments, concerns, Liana at nottherapyshow.com, nottherapyshow.com, at nottherapyshow. If you want to send me feedback, you're crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you. Talk next time.